reading through the chat as we go through, and I can ask her that question. We are also going to record the session today. So if you don't want your face on camera, a bit camera shy, you can just turn your camera off. And if you're seeing kind of subtitles at the bottom of your screen and it's distracting and you'd rather not, you can turn those off using the live transcript button. So that's all the housekeeping out of the way. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Laaleen Sukhera, who's very, very difficult to introduce neatly because she has so many strings to her bow. She's a specialist in global PR and copywriting, but has also been a magazine editor and a documentary TV producer. Her opinions are regularly published in a range of international media, including the BBC and the New York Times. And she is, of course, founder of the Jane Austen Society of Pakistan and co-author and curator of Austensian, the collection of stories written by people from that organization that we're discussing tonight. So welcome, Laaleen. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Hi, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And hi, everyone. Sorry, just a little typo, not a typo, just a slight mispronunciation. Austenistan.
Austenistan, got it.
Yeah, because we were talking about ostentatious earlier, and I think the two might have gotten a little mixed up.
No, you're right. That can be confusing. Ostentatious is a improv drama group, right? So I think I've mistaken. So Austenistan. So could you start by just telling us how you came to found the Jane Austen Society of Pakistan and how that led you to curate this story collection?
Well, that's a very good question. I suppose just a group of like-minded friends, and we were just getting together. This actually started after a Facebook page that I created, which sort of drew a community together. I was living in Islamabad at the time, but people all over the country and all over the world, share similar interests. So we decided, why don't we have a meetup sometime? And that's what happened. I started arranging meetups whenever I was traveling. So initially Islamabad, then Lahore, then Karachi, then London. So that's pretty much how we got started. It wasn't a traditional book club because with book clubs, you're reading something new and you discuss certain chapters. We met up on the premise that everybody had already read Austen and enjoyed Austen. And it was a very sort of organic kind of conversation, like there would be topics, as well as just our personal views with how we related, things we were doing, things we found interesting, and silly things as well, like quizzes and the occasional cosplay tea party. So this collection of short stories is actually the result of a conversation we had at one of our meetups, because a lot of us were journalists, academics, even barristers, and none of us had ever written fiction, even though we'd been published, in newspapers and journals and other media. So we thought, oh, wouldn't it be fun to write something together, like a short story? And, first of all, it'd be less embarrassing, if it was really, really bad, nobody would even read it. And second of all, there'd be so many of us, so the focus wouldn't just be on one person. So I went home and I wrote the concept, and I started inviting people to write based on, just instinctively, based on posts that I had seen them write on social media or conversations I'd had with them. So everyone was a first-time fiction writer, actually. So that's how it started.
That's amazing. Could you tell us a bit more about the Jane Austen Cosplay Tea Party?
Okay. Well, I mean, we don't take ourselves very seriously, so it's just a bit of fun. And it's actually quite easy to get those kind of outfits because it's basically just a maxi dress and with an empire waist, right? So either you cinch in the waist or you already have something in your wardrobe to that effect. And muslins, for instance, came from this part of the world, as did the shawls, as did the jewelry, and top knots were in fashion, as were ballet flats. So it was just really easy to put everything together. Even reticules, those are still worn, like embroidered pouches are still worn here. Brides or at weddings. So it was actually really easy to get everything together and then, you know, do like this tongue-in-cheek thing and name, you know, certain items on the menu with Regency. Actually, I had Georgia Terre inspired names for those because it wasn't just Austen, it was also the Regency period. So our first one was like a little more simple. And then our last one was actually a little more elaborate and a little more playful because we took on different characters. So I was Caroline Bingley and we called it, what did we call it? It was a tea at Netherfield. It was just really silly. And we were just in character, just being silly. And it's actually really fun to be like a mean girl. I found it more fun than being, you know, just a heroine because I could be like more sassy and more salty. So yeah.
Amazing. And could you just tell everyone, so the authors, they're still fictional stories. The author hasn't written the story about their own life. I was going to ask you how you got people to kind of open up about their heart's desires and about embarrassing things like having affairs, but perhaps they kind of made up some of those details. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, at the time, most of us were happily married. Well, they weren't autobiographical, but it was certainly about a social world we were all very familiar with. So to that effect, the stories are all fiction, they're fictionalized, but there are elements of ourselves in them, some unconscious elements that, you know, later on you realize, oh, okay, that actually is quite similar to a certain situation, for example, but it wasn't intentional. And I know, Madeline, you wanted to ask about, I don't know how you phrased it, about what was it like about being conscious or embarrassed of depicting certain things?
Yeah, I guess I was wondering if people, you know, how you drew out people being happy to talk about their heart's desires and potentially embarrassing things like having affairs and kind of being very concerned with social status. It was just a real skill to kind of, you know, write in a way that really got to people's deeper motivations.
Well, so at the time, I mean, we were all in our 30s and 40s. I mean, nobody was pretending to be a blushing virgin, so it didn't really matter in that way. And plus there was nothing specifically raunchy or anything. You know, the thought did cross our minds, oh, you know, what would my dad say if he reads this? But then again, safety in numbers once again. So I think writing fiction just sort of puts you out there, and initially you just develop a thicker skin. And later on, you just, nothing really, I don't know, I felt like it was a coming of age moment for me. So.
And what I really, really loved is just how entertaining the stories were. So it was just an absolute breeze for me to read. And it seemed as though that was your primary aim, to delight and amuse the reader. So while the books kind of brought up these themes of sexism and social class, the politics of studying and working abroad and loneliness, it always seemed very effortless and conversational. Was that intentional? Was it important to you to write books that people love to read? I'm just thinking of all the books that I've read recently that seem to want to sort of hit you over the head with an important message, but are actually a bit of a chore to get through.
Yeah, I know what you mean. That's the thing with commercial fiction, or even chick lit. It's escapist, but it's generally enjoyable. You know there'll be a happy ending, although we had a couple of ambiguous endings in our stories. But generally, it's a joy, it makes you laugh. And humor for me is really important, whether it's fiction or real life, even in the darkest moments, to find an element of humor or satire. And Austen is very funny. So I think most of us sort of took that element and made it part of our stories. It happened very naturally. It wasn't well thought out because we wrote these for ourselves. We did not realize we would get a global audience. So when the concept came into being, we were only writing for ourselves. We didn't realize we'd get Bloomsbury as a publisher. We didn't realize there'd be agents, you know, contacting me. Excuse me. So So we didn't actually have to pander to any expectations. And I know that, you know, especially a couple of years ago, there were a lot of expectations from this part of the world. Like you have to write about honor killing and terrorism and make everything a little more bleak and a little more horrifying. And I mean, I think there's space for that, but there's also space for this because there's universal themes like love and friendship and romance and yearning and desire. And I think these are relatable and universal. And I think that one doesn't really have to worry about what other people are expecting. You should just write what you know and write what you enjoy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it definitely does. And what's been the reaction since you published? So you didn't think that you'd kind of get an official publisher and things, and then that happened. What was that process like?
It was magical. It was like a dream. I mean, it started off like almost a joke. You know, we're sitting and laughing about it, and then we're like, yeah, let's just do it. I mean, things don't really happen that way in real life, do they? But they just did. And we got global acclaim and a lot of interest in our personal lives, which is really strange, especially from the international press. For like the domestic audiences, it wasn't a big surprise because people know of you know, we're from a more privileged class. So I think a lot of people in a lot of regions in the world were less aware of this because this is not something that's usually out there in pop culture. So it was sort of a window into this world, which seems very progressive at the same time as a bit debauched and at the same time as a bit regressive, like all of these strange contradictions running parallel and strangely similar to Austen's world 2 centuries ago, and in some ways more similar than England is today. So relatable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt I definitely learned a lot about modern Pakistan from the stories. So I love the gossipy aunties, the very label heavy fashion, the sort of glitzy parties, and then this sort of focus on getting married and making a good match. And you know, as is in every culture, there's this standard of behaviors that's expected of women, that there's a double standard of what's expected of men. Was capturing those, what was it like capturing those different aspects of Pakistani society?
It was sort of a relief. Again, this wasn't intentional. It just came out because double standards are part and parcel of the fabric of society here. So there will always be these crazy contradictions. And misogyny is just somehow less attractive in the 21st century than it was back then. So, so when you talk about it now, I think it's an important part of the narrative. No matter how chick lit you want to go, I mean, it's just the way it is. That's the framework. And it wasn't intentional. It just happened naturally. I mean, if we hadn't mentioned any of that, it just wouldn't have rung authentic. So, yeah.
And in many ways, I felt like the stories were kind of love letters to Lahore and Karachi. So I could really picture the character, you know, dancing in the monsoon as a child and then going to all these glitzy parties and weddings. How did you enjoy writing about these cities, and how did the other writers, was that important to them?
Cities feel like characters. They take on a soul. And, you know, a lot of us, I think we all chose to write about our hometowns. And I think you can see from those details, there's like this familiarity, this love, but also this angst and frustration at the same time. Because it's your hometown, you love it, but at the same time, you know what's wrong with it. With the exception of one story by Gayatri, she's actually Sri Lankan, and she was here. Her husband was a diplomat at the time in Islamabad. So she wrote about the Autumn Ball, which took place in the diplomatic enclave. Again, something very few people know, a very private, secluded world, heavily gated community with an insane amount of security. And she wrote about a ball there. And that's not her hometown, which is why I mentioned it. But again, you know, it was her home for 3 years. And there's an authenticity in writing about your city. And it's, yeah, as I said, it felt like those were characters in themselves. And a lot of times when you're, I don't know, I found that a lot of times when you're writing about characters, sometimes you want them to go a certain way, but they take a life of their own. But we did have limitations because they were short stories and I had to reduce the length. So yeah, a lot of people have asked, like, can you write more, or what happens to that character? But I didn't realize at the time that there's only to keep it as a paperback, we had to reduce the word count, and the publisher chose 7 stories. There were actually more stories as well from the initial group.
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah, there's always the cutting of the dreaded word count, isn't there? And one thing that I just found amazing and such a parallel to Austen is that the stories seem to contain, you know, events like weddings or balls or parties were such a main feature. Is that, you know, is that usual in this kind of upper echelon of Pakistani society, that events are a kind of huge thing?
Absolutely. I mean, shockingly, it's even been happening during the pandemic, and it's atrocious. Yes, I mean, the whole the Regency world, where people were introduced to each other as, you know, debutantes and people who wanted introductions to get married, essentially, and to be introduced into society. I mean, that still happens here, whether it's in cities in Pakistan or New York or London or Dubai, for example. It still happens. There's still all these balls and weddings, very splashy affairs. Yeah, they set the scene for a great many romances and marriages.
And I especially loved that lots of the female characters were particularly unlikable. So I'm thinking of Saira, who is very, very ready to betray her own sister. Was that intentional as well? Was it important to you to show women that aren't wholly saintly or subservient?
Yes, because as you get older and more experienced, you develop more empathy and you see the world as shades of gray. I mean, when we're young teenagers, we think everything's black and white. And then you grow up and you realize, oh, Mary Crawford, I actually feel for her. Or, and I think Mariah Bertram, especially, I always felt for Mariah Bertram. I mean, especially now, because, you know, I am divorced myself. So what happened with, so Saira, the story about Saira, Begum Saira, was written by Nida Eli, and it's based on Lady Susan. And we all know Lady Susan is an unlikable character. But when you read it, you develop an empathy for her, even though she's not the most conscientious person. You just can't help it. You just get fascinated by her and her lot in life. And similarly, Sanya Gohar's story about Caroline Bingley, the Mughal Empire, that made us sort of feel like what it would be like to be in Caroline Bingley's shoes. I mean, she's the traditional villain in Pride and Prejudice, but you realize, wow, she was actually socially humiliated because everybody knew she was so interested and so keen on Darcy, and to see an upstart like Elizabeth, you know, storm in and take over. How did she feel? How did she bounce back? So I feel like none of them are villains. They're all heroines in their own right.
Yeah, that was it. I had so much empathy for just people who wanted to go to parties and have a good time and be loved. So I think it was extremely well drawn. And in a similar way to Austen's books, the stories seem to separate marriage quite neatly into a business transaction that happens between families. So you make a good match for your family, and then kind of love matches, which are for your heart. Again, was that intentional and a kind of parallel to Austen's work?
Yeah, that wasn't intentional either, because actually that happens here a lot. And also it's families that get married to one another. It's literally like a union of families. So yeah, it wasn't intentional. It just naturally came about that way. And A lot of marriages are very romantic, and a lot of them are a little more cynical. It's more about, okay, I have a few good years left, childbearing years left. Let me see what's out there. But of course, we also have a remarriage market here. People from my generation are more disposed to finding happiness throughout their lives. So when they feel like their marriages are not particularly happy or toxic, so they end those, and then it starts all over again. And the questions start all over again too, like, have you met anyone yet? So it's endless over here. No matter how successful you are, the questions never stop, and the search never stops. The marriage market reigns supreme.
There were definitely some kind of darker themes. So the misogyny that we've already talked about, but lots of roguish men kind of taking advantage of younger women, this kind of pressure, being shunned by society for not meeting certain expectations. Was this a kind of cathartic chance to talk about some of the things in Pakistani society that you wanted to raise?
Oh, absolutely. There's a tremendous amount of social hypocrisy. I mean, it continues to this day, even though there's been considerable progress. Like, a lot of young girls have found their voices and are less moldable than they used to be. People are, a lot more people are getting married in their 30s as opposed to their early 20s. But that, again, I'm talking about a more privileged class. Yeah, there's always that feeling of, I don't know, slight retribution when you can talk about it and convey it in a way that isn't judgmental, but at the same time, it's familiar. Are you referring to the Lydia and Wickham scene, perhaps?
I was thinking of that, yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many Wickhams, there's so many Mr. Collinses as well. All of that is so relatable. It's still relatable. You still look around and you see the same characters straight out of novels. They're just dressed a little differently, but they behave the same. It's just remarkable how accurately she portrayed these characters 200 years ago.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually that lots of the characters kind of neatly aped Austen's characters. And do you think that's just because she caught, people that are out there in the world very well, or was that an intentional, you decided I'm going to write Mr. Darcy here?
Well, in the stories, some of the characters seem to be clearly inspired. Others were more like settings or situations, and they weren't, I would say some of the stories were more strongly influenced by Austen than others, and others were a little more subtle. So it depends. And also it leaves, I think, room for the reader to come up with their own judgments. Like I know Gayatri told me recently that somebody who had read and reviewed her book, people are still reading and reviewing the stories, had said her protagonist was Mary Bennet when she thought that her protagonist was more like Lizzie. So I found that very interesting. I think it's also what you see, when you're reading it, which is fantastic.
And are there any other Pakistani authors that you admire?
Oh, there's an abundance of talent here. And in terms of, English language fiction, I mean, this is a Commonwealth country, it's a former colony, so English is taught in schools. I actually am one of those people who keeps rereading classics and childhood favorites, which is when you saw me in the Georgette Hare. I mean, I was reading Hare since I was 12 and Austen since same age. So I just keep going back to them like they're my best friends. But in terms of Pakistani writers, I love humor. So some years ago, Maha Khan Phillips had a book, Beautiful from This Angle. I liked that. I enjoyed it. And then Alia Afzal Khan has one that's coming out now, Would I Lie to You? So I'm looking forward to that. I like books that have a bit of hope and romance, especially during these days. I feel like we need something to laugh about and fantasize about. I mean, I think I've cried enough in life, you know. I just want to laugh now. So, and drama is great too, you know. I love drama, but I think it's just time to laugh and enjoy life a little more.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's what I loved about these stories so much. They were just so easy to read and so kind of heartening.
Oh, thank you. Good to know. Thank you so much.
And oh, we've just got a message through from the audience. Had you known at the start that you were going to be published and widely read, would you have been more guarded or written differently, do you think?
I would have been so much more self-conscious. All of us would. I think we would have all needed pep talks. Yes, for sure. Even now, as I sit down and try to write notes for a novel, I feel more self-conscious because I know that if it makes it to print, it'll be read. Yeah, definitely more guarded. I don't know how it would have come out. You know, crazy things were happening to some of us while we wrote these stories. Like I was in the last year of a very difficult marriage, and just compiling this anthology just held me together. And another of my friends, you know, she was going through a tough time as well. And she sat one weekend and wrote it, and she kept getting interrupted by her staff and her children and everybody. And she was like, no, I just have to write it. You know how it is as a woman, you're constantly interrupted. And that's how it is for us now, you know, with work from home sort of situations. And then Gayatri, who had written the story set in Islamabad, she said, she was in the middle of a move. She was surrounded by cardboard boxes when she wrote her story. She was moving to Jordan at the time. So it was, those were not easy circumstances, but we did it. We did it. And it was just the joy of writing and the sort of group dynamic we had. You know, we had a WhatsApp group and we had a private Facebook forum, and we just shared our ideas and read each other's scenes. That was the joy of it. It was a delight. So
yeah, I think it really, really shines through.
I don't know. It would have definitely been different had we known.
And do you have plans to write more? Are we going to see updates to some of the chapters, or even, you know, longer, fully formed novels?
That's a very good question. Initially, there was supposed to be a second volume, but that's not happening. I'm just focusing on writing a novel now. I hope I manage to do it. I just keep talking about it and not really doing. And that's how the idea came out in the first place, because I was just talking about it on social media. I'm not really one to keep a secret. And that's how it just, you know, became buzzworthy. But if you're talking about the other writers, I'm not sure. Well, Nida is a fiction writer. She's written quite a bit. And she's also taught essays in Texas, essay writing. And so she does write. She's written some poetry as well. Sanya, I think, might be working on something. I'll have to ask her and remind her. It's like, it really helps when you push each other a little bit. But no, there's nothing else in terms of, but in terms of, you mean updating these stories?
Yeah,
I don't know,
I
it depends.
To see what had happened to some of the characters.
Oh, you want to know? Well, there were longer stories initially, and there were scenes that were chopped out. So,
and what was that process of editing like? How did you go about, you know, editing other people's work, and were they kind of precious about it?
That's the thing I realized from our initial pool of 18 writers, there were a few who were very difficult to work with, and I don't even want to think about that time. There were just a few that were difficult to work with. Everybody else was just a delight. And, you know, we were all so open to all kinds of constructive criticism and feedback. And we wanted it, we relished it. So that was the first step. And the second step was when Bloomsbury came on board. And then I worked with Faiza Khan, who's a consulting publisher there. And, you know, her feedback was fabulous. She knows her job. She does it really well. So I would get feedback from her and then edit accordingly, and then work with each writer for their stories and then work on them myself as well. So it was a very collaborative process, and there were no big egos or anything. Nobody was, it wasn't like that. I mean, if you've written an honors thesis and had like 30 pages chopped out of it, you learn early on that nothing is permanent when it comes to a manuscript or a report.
Well, it's cheering to hear that there were no, I thought having a big ego was a kind of thing that every writer has as a natural state.
Well, not newbies.
And I've just got a question from
I think it's important to keep an open mind. Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a question from the audience. Do you think nowadays, instead of going on online dating and using apps, we should go back to the days where a family member arranged a suitable marriage?
Oh, hell no. Because what happens then is you only meet your immediate circle. And that's how a lot of us got married. It was our friends, family friends, or, someone in another city, but also connected to your social circle. And it's a very incestuous society here. I think apps probably give people a lot more choice and a lot more variety, but at the same time, I think people get so distracted. There's so much out there. That's a really good question.
I really dread to think who I'd end up with if my father chose. I'd probably end up with a father.
No. I mean, I think it's more romantic to go to meet somebody yourself and not necessarily have any family connections. It's always interesting to be with somebody who's completely different, but at the same time, similar wavelength. I think both come with their own risks. I mean, obviously parents would prefer to play a hand in everything, but the world is digital now. So I think there's only so much they can control. There's a whole world out there.
And another question from the audience. Did you agree between you which books you'd use as an inspiration for the short stories? It's always interesting which books are most popular in different countries. Emma and Pride and Prejudice in the UK, but you mentioned Mansfield Park and Lady Susan, which are not so popular in the UK. Well, we're just wondering which Austen books are most popular in Pakistan.
Well, each writer chose whatever everyone was free to choose, but Pride and Prejudice definitely got more votes than anyone else. And from the stories that were selected, most of them were Pride and Prejudice, although we actually covered all of her novels. Even Sanditon, like everything was covered. So I think it's also because Pride and Prejudice has a higher degree of humor, and it just seemed to work better. In terms of popularity, yeah, it's the best known. I mean, I don't think Persuasion is very well known here. I would say after Pride and Prejudice, it's Sense and Sensibility, simply because of the period drama, how many adaptations are out, and what's on Netflix at the moment as well. That always helps. So I think, yeah.
Do you think you can see a Clueless of Emma style film about Pakistani society?
Oh, that would be fun. I know that there was a Bollywood movie which was a copy of Clueless. So I didn't watch it. Yeah, there was some years ago. But I mean, it came out with the tagline that it was, I mean, basically the reviews were like, oh, it's adapted from Emma, but it was a clear copy of Clueless. So, wow. I mean, I'd like to see it if it's original, a little more original.
And I wanted to ask you actually, what do you think of the categorization of chick lit? You've mentioned that a few times. I know some people, like that category. Other people feel it's patronizing. Where do you stand, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's misunderstood. I don't think it's a particularly flattering category. And the only reason I mentioned it is because it's been around since the 90s, since Bridget Jones's Diary, for example. And a lot of times it's dismissed as fluff, but even if you look at Bridget Jones's Diary, I mean, there's a lot of, if you peel back the layers, there's a lot there too. There's sexual harassment, there's gaslighting, there's body shaming. It all depends on how you read it. And it becomes more of a bittersweet experience then. So yeah, and what's the opposite of chicklet? Dicklet, you know? So I think it's also a way of putting down women, just dismissing them, you know, oh, rom-coms, women's movies, chicklet. So I think if you sort of take ownership of terms, then sometimes you can dispel those myths and sort of add to the narrative.
Mm-hmm. And I definitely, as I've said, what I kind of loved about yours was the lightness of touch. So all of these themes explored, but without a kind of, now we are going to talk about an important message.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there are a lot of messed up things that happen in this country. You know, we have an extremist element, we have all kinds of misogyny, but at the same time, we are talking about drawing room conversations and romance. So there's no need to bring in, you know, terrorism and honor killing and all kinds of things that people expect from this part of the world. And I mean, this isn't a news report, it's fiction. Mm-hmm. So if it's news that you'd like to see or a documentary, then read nonfiction, read an editorial. Why would you go to a contemporary fiction aisle and pick this up? It's pretty clear from the branding on the cover that that's not what it is.
Mm-hmm. And this is a message from the audience. If you had to choose, which Austen character do you identify with the most?
Right now, at this moment in life? In time?
So, yes. But you could give us different characters throughout your life if you prefer.
Oh yeah, okay. There's so many. So I started off as Catherine Morland, Northanger Abbey, young and curious and fancying herself a detective, always feeling left out. And in that way, I also identified with Kitty Bennet, one of the sillier younger sisters, but not confident enough to go and do something wild and crazy, but always feeling left out and trying to keep up with her older sister and cousins. And then I think as I got older, Emma and Lizzie. Emma, because my mom died when I was young, and I ended up living with my father when I came back from America. And I've always played Cupid, and I've never felt the need to get married. And I only did when I realized, oh, I should have a baby before I'm 30. So there was that. And then Lizzie, because Lizzie's funny and she doesn't take people very seriously. And, you know, she puts men down when she wants to. So there's always that Lizzie part. And then I suppose as I got older, a little bit of Anne Elliot, but without the patience. A little bit of Marianne, just tempestuous. And my sister calls me a drama queen. My sister actually wrote the first story, coincidentally. And yeah, and I don't know, I just feel bad for Mary Crawford. Am I mistaken? Is it Mary Crawford or is it Maria Bertram? Sorry, Maria Bertram. I just feel bad for her. Now, I don't have the same life as her. Like I didn't, you know, go out and have an affair with somebody and then leave my husband for him or anything like that. But I just felt like, wow, she must have felt really trapped. You know, she was making a good match and then she realized, I don't know, I just felt really bad for her. And that's more of an empathy sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't have the patience of Anne Elliot, but that whole part about, you know, second chances and sort of rebooting your life, although she was just 27, you know, but at that time that was considered a very mature age. So that whole part about renewing your life and stepping into another phase of life where you kind of have a better idea of who you are and what you want, and you have a thicker skin and a little more confident. Yeah, perhaps that. And then because I have daughters, Mrs. Bennet, although I tell them the opposite. I say, please wait until you're in your 30s before you get married. You know, go to college, build your own Pemberley. So yeah.
So you're not like the aunties in your stories, sort of hovering at parties, looking for rich men.
Certainly not, although I still like to play Cupid. So I still like to do that.
And we've just got a few minutes left, so I'm just gonna let everyone unmute, because I think the audience might have some questions they want to ask you directly. So if anyone's got anything to ask, now's the chance. And if not, we've got a message come through the chat here. Do Austen and Haya fulfill different literary needs for you, or are they one and the same?
Oh, wow, what a great question. I think Austen is someone, Austen's work is always, first of all, there's only 6 completed novels. So there's so much less to go back to in that way. But I feel like no matter what age you are, when you go back to it and read it, it has a different meaning and you notice different things. But for Georgette Hare, I feel like it's more escapist for me. It's more fun in general, except for maybe a few of her novels. And I'm talking about the Regency ones, not the mysteries. There are some that just I know are going to make me laugh, and I find them very romantic. And they're more, and they're about aristocrats rather than the more upper middle class. So they're more glamorous. I mean, there's dukes and there's the Prince Regent and a few of them as well, at least one of them. And there's references, there's Beau Brummel. So I love that. And she has her own, she had her brand of vocabulary, her humor are just wonderful. But Austen is Austen. I don't know. Yeah, I think they do fulfill different sides. I've actually never thought about it that way. And it's just strange that I started reading them at 12 and I'm still reading them. I didn't realize this would happen. So has that happened for anyone else? Like reading the same books again and again your whole life?
And the same actually for me. So Jane Austen and Georgette Hare. So last weekend I read 5 Georgette Hares back to back, and I couldn't do that with Jane Austen, but I love anybody who loves and appreciates Georgette Hare, because she is completely brilliant within her genre. She's absolutely brilliant. So I'm so pleased to hear what you're saying. But also I think the Jane Austens are the books that I have read over and over again, and every time, and I think that's where there's a difference with Georgette Hare. Every time you read a Jane Austen book, as you're saying, you see different things in it as you change your own age and your own experience, I think. And it is so multi-layered and there's so much in it. I think they are just, they are a whole different league, but Georgette Hare is still fantastic, actually, even so.
Yeah, I feel like rereading a few now that we're talking about her. Is there anything you've noticed recently, any detail you've noticed now that didn't strike you before? If you don't mind, if I'm turning the questions back to
in the
you.
Austens, in
In either. Is there anything new that you've maybe noticed, or something that struck you?
I think in the Austens, it is that I think particularly not so much Pride and Prejudice and Emma, because they're very much young people's books, but I think Mansfield Park, I'm really interested actually across the way that the characters that you mention are not necessarily the leading characters. They're very interesting what you're saying about Maria Bertram, actually, because she's always seen as such a as a shallow character, and that understanding of what sort of a tough choices that she made and tough life that she had. And I think as you get older, and I'm a lot older than you become more sympathetic, I think, to characters, and you see different things and you see different aspects of it. And I mean, the Georgette Hares, actually, I hadn't read many for a while, actually, and seeing them through a sort of prism, particularly of the last 10 years, I think, where there's been much more, you suddenly realize some of the plots, I mean, it doesn't stop them, but some of the books, you get, for example, quite a lot of, anti-Semitism suddenly turning up. It's not necessarily anti-Semitism, but it's just that there are things that I'd be interested actually to see in a recent, one of them that I read, there was a particular character that you just would not be able to have in a book today, actually. And you'd have to edit that out, I think. And also it's quite a lot of older men and quite young women, actually, in a way that as a mother of a daughter, I would have thought distinctly dodgy if it had happened to my daughter. And of course, when I was 12 and 25 and 35, and all the times I've read the books over and over again, I didn't necessarily see that, but you see things differently now. So it's both your own age, but also the recognition of a lot of stuff coming to the fore now that puts a different light on those books, I think, and the age that they were written in, which was the 1950s, of course. So see, people saw things differently then.
Very well put. That's so true.
Very sorry. We've got to wrap it up there. But thank you so much for coming, Laaleen. It was so amazing to hear your thoughts. And I really
thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm hoping you will produce a second volume, and I'll definitely buy your novel when it's out.
Oh, that's so nice of you. Just keep guilting me into it so I do it, please.
Great, and thank you everybody else. And look out, we'll send through details of the next club, so look out for that. And one day, as I always say, hopefully we'll all be able to meet in the Groucho.
Oh, that would be amazing. Is it okay if I take a screenshot? Can I take a screenshot?
Of course, go ahead if everyone
is comfortable. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay.
Great.
Lovely.
Thank you all very much. I'm running off to a sunny drink. Hope everyone else is too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.